If you're a regular mobile gamer or find yourself enjoying noir detective stories from the 1920s, then I've got some good news for you. Because today's video is sponsored by the thrilling murder mystery puzzle game, June's Journey. In June's Journey, you play the role of the titular detective searching for clues during the glamorous Roaring Twenties, all whilst interacting with a diverse cast of fascinating characters. June's goal is to identify her sister's murderer, then bring them to justice. But delving into her family's murky history will dredge up some dark and unexpected secrets. It's the perfect mobile game for all you true crime and murder mystery enthusiasts, as figuring out which on-screen objects constitute clues can be very satisfying indeed. So, if that sounds like your idea of fun, you can download the game absolutely free by clicking the link in the description of this video. And June's Journey isn't just available on Android and iOS devices, it's available to play on your home computer through Facebook Games. So, if you want to travel 100 years into the past in order to solve a chilling murder through thrilling puzzles, download June's Journey today to begin your very own mystery adventure. Back when I was 19, I used to work at this cookie stand in a big mall not too far from my house. We had this cheap business cell that we'd used to take pickup orders on, so when it started ringing, I'd rush to pick it up so I could take the order. I hear this guy's voice on the other end, and right away, I start thinking it's a prank call or something. This might sound weird, but you know when you can practically hear a person smiling on the other end, or rather, trying to hold back laughter or something. His voice sounded exactly like that. He says, do you make cookies to order? I told him, sure. And that we make chocolate chip, double chocolate, macadamia nut, raspberry, white chocolate, all those. And then he starts asking a bunch more questions, sounding weirdly anxious as he does so, asking what time we're open until, where in the mall we are, all this other stuff, and I'm just staying polite and answering all his questions. When I'm done answering his questions, he asked me what types of cookies we make again, and I really started getting the feeling that something was weird and off with this call. I'd literally only just told the guy what kinds of cookies we made, and it's not like it was a huge list or whatever. But still, I stay professional and repeat myself. Then he just says, okay, thanks, and ends the call. I'm thinking to myself, well, that was weird. But I just carry on with my shift as normal, thinking the guy just might turn up and buy some or whatever later. About an hour later, the phone goes again, and when I answer, I can blatantly recognize the exact same voice on the other end of the phone, asking me the exact same questions as before in the exact same tone. Do you, make cookies to order? Again, I keep it professional. It was my first real job, and I really didn't want to get fired. But I was definitely starting to feel like I was the victim of some dumb prank call, like maybe it was being recorded or something. So although it was definitely a little passive-aggressive, I opted for something such as, oh, hey, it's you again. We spoke earlier, right? Well, if you remember, we make chocolate chip, double chocolate, macadamia nut, or raspberry, and white chocolate. You want me to put you down for an order? Just let me know a time you can swing by to pick them up. There's a slight pause, and I actually think he's going to place an order. But all he says is, your hair looks really pretty today. For a second, I thought, knew it. This is some sort of weird prank. But then I paused and thought to myself, can he actually see me? I was so taken aback that I remember replying, excuse me? And although I expected to just hear a bunch of guys laughing, there was just silence before he just hung up. And I suddenly found myself really on edge, going back and forth between thinking it was a prank and thinking, oh God, can he actually see me? I was so distracted by it that my next customer actually asked me if I was okay, and as much as I assured him that I was definitely still feeling a little on edge. By saying that, it didn't take me long to assure myself that it was such a generic comment that he probably wasn't watching me, and that it was all just some creepy prank call, probably from a bunch of bored middle schoolers or something. But I also had this deep suspicion that whoever it was would call back eventually, and as it turned out, that suspicion was correct. Only maybe a half an hour after the second call, the phone in the cookie stall goes off again, and this time, I definitely recognized the last few digits of the guy's number. Part of me just didn't want to answer the call, but another part of me wanted to let the guy know that he definitely couldn't intimidate me with just a few prank calls. So, I picked up the phone and gave him a curt, "Yes?" He then says it again. "Your hair looks really pretty today." So I hit him with a, "Oh yeah? What style is it in?" So then imagine my horror when he not only describes the exact style it was in, but also brings up the pink highlights I had dyed into it like a week earlier. I didn't know what else to say other than, "You call here again and I'm reporting your number to the cops," before hanging up. As soon as I did, I started leaning out of the stall and looking around, trying to spot someone hanging around and watching me from a distance, but there was no one there. That really freaked me out, thinking the person had walked past me at some point during my shift, that I'd probably looked at them and just had no idea that they had such creepy intentions for me. Just to be sure, I ended up saving the number in the phone under creep, so there'd be no doubt about who was calling in the future. If the creep number came up, I'd just end the call without answering, then report the whole thing to my boss and the cell phone company so we could get the number blocked. They tried calling a few more times about an hour later, but I just did as I'd planned and ended the calls almost as soon as they came up. After that, they stopped trying, and by the time it was the last hour of my shift and almost time to close up the stall, I started to feel a little calmer again. Then, right as I was about to close up shop, the phone rang again, this time from a different number than the creep's, so I immediately picked it up. As soon as I say hello, I realized that I'd made a huge mistake. It was the creep, and all he'd done was switch numbers somehow when he realized that I wasn't going to pick up. I also realized that I'd made a huge mistake in telling him when we closed, because the first thing he says to me is, "You're close to closing time, right? Then I'm guessing you're walking out to the parking lot to your car?" That had my heart racing, because yes, that's exactly what I was going to do, and either it was just a really good guess, or he'd been watching me way longer than I thought he'd had. For a second, I just didn't know what to say in return. I was so freaked out that I was actually stunned into silence. But although the words didn't come immediately, I just knew that I had to be aggressive, to try and show that I wouldn't go down without a fight. It took every ounce of bravery I had in me, and it may have been an overreaction initially, but I told him if I see anyone following me to my car, I'd claw their eyes out. I thought that might be enough, but the guy just laughed, then started saying stuff so evil and obscene that I honestly don't want to repeat it. Whoever was calling me that day had something wrong with them to dream up things like that. I know I should have just hung up the call straight away, but I think I was just so stunned for a second that I kept on listening. Something about their tone changed too. They sounded less like a dumb teenager and more like an intelligent, older man who was so full of this sick, twisted aggression. I was so scared that it actually took me a minute to get myself together enough to hang up. And as soon as I did, I called my dad and told them everything. How I didn't feel comfortable closing the stall on my own, and would he be okay driving down to walk me to my car. Of course, he came as quickly as he could, and he called the cops as I was closing up to tell them the number the guy called from. I was fighting back tears the whole time, and when I finally got to my car, I just burst into tears. My dad comforting me as I told him some of the things the guy had said to me over the phone. Just repeating them had him going pale and shaking with anger. I've honestly never seen him like that before, and every single evening after that, he'd show up an hour after I finished work, watching as I closed the stall down and then walking me to my car. For some reason, the cops were unable to trace the exact caller and they couldn't actually track the guy down, but they told us that they'd pinged the numbers off of 2 different cell towers in our county, and he was definitely a local guy calling from somewhere relatively close. And other than that, there was nothing they could do but tell us to contact them if it ever happened again, as well as practicing caution when it came to my daily routine. That just wasn't good enough for me or Dad, as it amounted to hoping that nothing would happen to me, and as Dad put it, hope is not a plan. It sucked having to leave that job, as it was pretty much unsupervised and I got to take home any cookies that weren't sold at the end of the day. But it was either quit or risk the situation with my stalker escalating to the point where he'd actually show up and do something. Like I said, I don't really want to repeat the things that he'd said he'd do to me, but I can promise you, they really didn't sound like empty, abstract threats. They sounded like things that he'd put some serious thought and planning into, which is exactly why I found them so upsetting. We later found out that another girl, who worked at the same mall I used to, ended up getting similar phone calls that ended up in similar threats, so it wasn't just me that had to suffer through that kind of abuse. In fact, it's actually kind of shocking how many other girls experience that kind of abuse in their lives at some point. And although most of the creeps don't actually follow up with it, I can tell you from experience that it can be an extremely stressful and frightening ordeal, especially when you're young. A few years ago, I woke up just after noon one day to the sound of my phone vibrating next to me on the bed. I'm not lazy, I just work nights, so sleeping into the afternoon is a normal occurrence for me. When I rolled over, picked up the phone, and saw an unknown number on the screen, my first thought was to just hit the red button and send the caller to voicemail. But right as my thumb was hovering over it, a little voice in my head told me it might be important. What gets me about this particular bit of intuition is that it's one of the only times I've ever looked at a random number and thought that. Most people just text ahead if it's really important, right? To at least let you know who's calling and for what reason, so that you actually pick up the phone. So even though I wanted nothing more than to just roll over and go back to sleep, I hit green and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't even manage to get a hello out before all I heard was, "You need to evacuate the building as soon as possible." The voice on the other end was a bloke who sounded about my age, so believe it or not, my first thought was that it was one of my mates playing a prank on me after getting themselves a new number. I asked who was calling, and they didn't answer. All they said was, "There's no time for that. You need to just get out of the building as quickly as you can." I remember sitting up in bed and just straight asking if it was Tom, a mate of mine, because it sounded a lot like him, and then asking if it was some sort of prank. The voice on the other end then gets even more serious than it was before and tells me, no, that it's not Tom, and that he's from the letting agency and that they've been calling everyone to get them out of the building. I start to panic at that point, but, and this might sound mental, I still had a lot of doubts about the whole situation. I mean, if there was something as serious as a gas leak, something serious enough that we needed to be evacuated, wouldn't the fire brigade have come round with gas masks or something? Why was it down to the letting agency to call all our mobiles to tell us something so serious? This all went through my head at a mile a minute, by the way. I wasn't just laying there in bed like a dope. I was pulling some socks on, looking for my pants, and while I was doing that, I asked them about the whole fire brigade thing. "They're on their way," the voice said. "Now please make your way to the fire assembly point. It's not safe to be your flat." I'm not sure what compelled me to do this, but I thought that I'd check out my windows to see if anything was happening in the street outside. I always had the curtains drawn with me sleeping a lot during the day, so I had to part them a little bit to see outside. But then as soon as I did, I knew it was no prank, as the usually busy road outside was totally deserted. It's one of the busiest streets in the whole city, even at night, and there wasn't a single car or person to be seen anywhere. And not only that, but I could actually see a couple of policemen at both ends of the street, with police tape up preventing people or cars from turning onto it. I was already kind of panicking by that point, but seeing the concrete reality of it, and how dangerous the situation actually was to warrant closing the entire street off, I just went into full-on panic mode in that moment. I didn't even bother putting on shoes or anything, and I just threw on a dirty plaid shirt without even bothering to button it up. I'd already hung up the phone by the time I reached the front door. Then, when I walked out into the hallway, the smell just hit me. It was flammable gas, but in such a high concentration that it made me feel almost dizzy as I began to walk towards the stairwell to the near car park. As I was walking, I had two major fears. Number one, that there was so much gas in the hallway that it would make me pass out, and that I'd never be able to get out of the building. And number two, and easily the worst one, that the building would ignite into flames right as I was about to leave, and I'd die in the blaze just seconds before my escape. I think it was maybe 20 to 30 seconds of me walking downstairs, but it felt like way longer because at literally any second, I expected the whole building to explode or something. Obviously it didn't, or I probably wouldn't be around to tell this story, but to think that all it would have taken is one little spark or something, it sent shivers down my spine. Thankfully, I made it out into the car park, out the back of the building, where everyone else was waiting while looking equally worried as me. There wasn't that many people, with it being a weekday afternoon, but we definitely all had this same "we could be dead right now" feeling about us. It was just surreal in the extreme. You're supposed to feel safe at home, and it was extra surreal for me going from being fast asleep to being told that I was in extreme danger, all within about 10 seconds or something. In the end, once the fire brigade had shown up, we were all told that we'd have to find somewhere else to stay, and those that couldn't would have to contact the landlords or letting agency in order to get them to find alternative accommodation. I ended up just going to stay with my parents until the weekend, when I got the call that it was safe to go back, but even so, I never quite felt 100% comfortable there again, and started looking for a different flat not long after when I had the money for a security deposit saved up. A few years ago, my daughter and her friends wanted to go to London for her birthday. It was to be Ella's first time traveling down there unaccompanied, but we reckoned that since she was 18, technically an adult, and was traveling with her friends, that it wouldn't be a problem. She had plenty of spending money. Since she had her phone with her too, she had access to map applications and other things that'd prevent her from getting lost or what have you. As long as she kept her phone with her, she'd have everything she needed, and wouldn't lose her train tickets, as they were those e-ticket things. We also set her up with Apple Pay so that she couldn't accidentally spend all of her cash and be left with nothing for emergencies either. Don't get me wrong, me and her mom were still quite nervous about her heading off on her own for the first time, but all the things I just mentioned definitely eased our minds when it came to her safety. As the morning ticked over to lunchtime, I got a text from her saying that she'd arrived safely, and that she was heading to Oxford Street to get some shopping done. After that, I tried to distract myself with football as best I could so that I wasn't constantly worrying about her. Her mom was the same, telling me to just relax, that she'd call us if she really needed anything. In the end, I actually managed it too. I put my phone on charge, went to do some gardening, and had a cup of tea in the sun while my wife went off to her Pilates classes in the early afternoon. Then it was about 2 o'clock when I decided that I'd waited long enough to give Ella a call to see how she was getting on. So I get up and head over to my phone, only to find that I have about 4 or 5 missed calls from Ella. I was kicking myself for not having my phone closer to me, and had somehow managed to leave it on that do not disturb mode that I put on when I go to bed, but it wasn't exactly like I was panicking or anything as I called her back. But then, as soon as the call was answered, and heard the voice on the other end, I felt my stomach drop. All I heard was, "Hello?" And I instantly knew the person answering the phone was not my daughter. It was a deep voice, a man's voice, and for a second I actually thought that I might have called someone else by accident. I had to pull the phone away from my face to check if the call was connected to Ella and not one of my work colleagues or something. When I asked, "Where's Ella?" there was a slight pause before the man on the other end just said, "Ella's gone." Then a second later, he hung up. Bit of a weird reference here, but remember in Jaws when there's the bit with Martin Brody seeing a shark attack happen for the first time, and the camera sort of zooms in around him as this sense of pure horror hits him? That's exactly what it felt like. Standing there with the phone in my hand, realizing that something completely terrible might have just happened to my little girl. I need to throw in a little side note at this point, and that's how, if I'd actually kept calm and thought sensibly about the whole thing, I'd probably have avoided most of the horror that came after. But I didn't. I went into complete and utter panic mode, and for some stupid reason I decided to call Ella's phone back. Whenever whoever it was picked up on the other end, all I heard was laughing, which filled me with this combination of absolute terror and absolute rage. I demanded to know where my daughter was, and the person on the other end sounded nothing short of pure evil when they said something along the lines, "Somewhere she'll never escape from. But don't worry, we're gonna treat her really good." I just started shouting, "Where is she? Where is she?" over and over again, stopping only when I heard the same sick laughter coming down the line. I only managed to pull myself out of it when the guy started saying, "Do you want to talk to her? Do you? Well, beg. Beg us and maybe we'll let you." I knew I had to do something. I mean, actually do something before it was too late. I just hung up the phone and dialed 999. I was still telling the operator that my daughter was missing, describing what she looked like and who she was with when my wife came back from her class. When I told her what was happening, she went into panic mode too, and I struggled to hold back the tears when she cried, telling herself that she knew it was a huge mistake to let Ella go to London on her own. But then, when she calmed down slightly, she got out her phone and started calling someone, and it was only when I asked her who it was she was calling that I realized that I might have severely overreacted. I realized that I hadn't called any of Ella's friends, and we made sure to get their numbers as well as the numbers of their parents right around the time that Ella announced that she wanted the day trip to celebrate her 18th. I waited on hold, waited for some kind of detective or something. Well, my wife suddenly perked up with one of Ella's friends answering her phone. I heard her saying, "Sophie, where are you? Is Ella there?" Then there was a brief pause before she almost wailed and, "Oh my God, thank God for that." Then she burst into tears again. She then got up from a kitchen chair, walked over to me for what I thought was a hug of relief. But she didn't hug me. She just started smacking me about the face and shoulders. Ella was fine. She just lost her phone, and it just so happened that a gang of absolute oxygen thieves had picked it up, then decided to play an extremely cruel prank on the person who called her phone, the person they knew was her dad because the number was labeled as such. It was all for nothing. I completely overreacted, let the cruel laughter of those little idiots and the panic of thinking that I'd lost her completely impair my judgment. And I felt like an idiot too, like a complete and utter moron. But there's one thing I need you to understand, and that's how what I thought was happening, what I wrongfully assumed was happening, is every parent's worst nightmare. The kind of fear that thought fills you with, you just can't compare it with anything else. Then I was so prepared for the worst that it was almost like I wanted those prejudices to be confirmed. I wasn't an overly protective paranoid father. I was right. The world was horrific. It was cruel, a predatory place, and I never should have let Ella out of my sight. Only, that wasn't true. All that had happened is that her phone had fallen out of her handbag, or she'd left it on a table and some little idiot had decided to play a cruel prank on me. I suppose this is a bit of a washout story in some ways. Ella was never really in any danger. It was all just in my head. But for a few moments I thought my entire world had ended. I thought me and my wife would be two of those parents that your heart bleeds for, making some tearful appeal on TV while begging their little girl's captors to let her go. For as long as they've been around, scary stories and urban legends alike have used the telephone as a central theme. From H.P. Lovecraft's The Statement of Randolph Carter to the opening scene of the multi-part Scream franchise, creepy telephone calls have captured the imagination of worldwide audiences for almost 100 years now. Yet back in 2007, a series of mysterious and terrifying events in the U.S. state of Washington proved once and for all that real life can be far stranger than fiction. This is the story of the restricted caller. In the Tacoma suburb of Fircrest, 16-year-old Courtney Kirkendall began to experience something very strange indeed. Her friends began to complain that she was sending them some rather cryptic text messages and asked her what they meant. But there was one major problem. Courtney hadn't been texting them at all, and she had the empty sent folder to prove it. Before Courtney's parents had the chance to address the issue, her phone began to receive a series of phone calls from someone with a scratchy voice, who called from a number which simply read, "restricted." The calls consisted of the man with the scratchy voice describing whatever Courtney was doing at that particular moment, letting her know in the creepiest way possible that he was somehow watching her from afar. Yet these calls weren't just restricted to young Courtney, as one of the Kirkendall's neighbors, Andrea McKay, also found herself a target of the mysterious calls. One day, she answered her phone while cutting limes in her kitchen, only to have the mysterious caller tell her that he preferred lemons. By the time that the Kirkendall family noticed that all of their cell phones were behaving strangely, they decided to contact their local police department. They complained that their phones were not only sending text messages on their own, but they were also turning themselves on unprompted, with the ringtone spontaneously changing. They also informed the police of the bizarre phone calls that they were receiving, and after turning the devices over to the police, they were assured that any further calls would be traced in order to identify the mysterious caller. In the days that followed, when a call came into one of the family's phones, police began to quickly trace the origin of it. Yet when they finally identified the source of the calls, they came from a place they least suspected. You see, according to the trace program, the calls were coming from Courtney's phone, even when it was switched off. This led police to recommend that the family switch cell phones altogether, but since they couldn't afford to, they simply kept their current phones and hoped the problem would subside on its own. But instead of petering out, the calls only grew more intense. Heather Kirkendall, the family matriarch, claimed that during one call, the scratchy voice caller said, "They say you're going to die. We hate you. We're going to murder you." The calls also started coming during the midnight hours, and even if the family members turned their phones off, whoever had control of their devices would simply switch them on before calling. In the end, they were forced to take the batteries out at night in order to get any real sleep. Arguably, the most terrifying call came to the neighboring McKay family, with the caller claiming that there was going to be a shooting at their children's school. The caller also seemed to know the exact school that they were attending, which made the threat all the more frightening for their terrified parents. The McKays were so scared and upset by the call that they called the threat into their children's school, but thankfully, no such shooting ever occurred. The next escalation in the calls came when one didn't feature the scratchy voice caller at all, but rather a recording of a private conversation between members of the Kirkendall family. One such call featured a recording of a conversation between one of the family members and a detective who was dealing with their case, as if to show that the caller was well aware of their attempts to apprehend him. It was like the caller knew the police were almost incapable of catching him, and the Fircrest PD had stated on multiple occasions that the investigation was floundering. It's entirely possible that the scratchy-voiced man had heard this admission somehow, in the same way he'd listened to and recorded the family's conversations. Despite the caller violating several federal laws, law enforcement was still warming up to the idea of cybercrime in 2007. Fircrest Police Chief John Cheeseman told the media, "We're almost dumbfounded. We've never seen anything like this." Their confusion was such that, at one point, the police actually suspected one of the family members as being the guilty party, with one detective stating that, "At this point, we aren't saying it's someone inside the family, but it's someone that is close enough to them to know this much about them. It seems like it's someone who is tied into the group, a family member, a friend or enemy." For a brief period, The story of the Kirkendall's digital harassment drew the interest of both the regional and national media. But when the police failed to bring about a speedy resolution to the case, journalistic interest seemed to drop off entirely. To this day, the case remains entirely unresolved, and although incidents of phone hacking are relatively rare, they're surprisingly easy to pull off. Phone hacking, or phone breaking as it used to be called, has been going on since the telephone was first invented. Telecommunications enthusiasts began by hacking payphones and learning how to impersonate phone operators in order to make free calls, and if a person had access to the right technology, tapping a phone line was a frighteningly simple process. Even today, in the age of advanced digital security and two-step authentication, phone hacking is still a very real possibility, with hackers remaining only 1 or 2 steps behind even the most cutting-edge technology. And these days, it's clear we rely on our phones for almost everything. They serve as our wallets, our televisions, our record players, our cameras, and our photo albums. You need only remind yourself of the minor panic you last experienced when you thought you'd lost your phone. It's scary enough thinking that we've become addicted to them, but perhaps it's even scarier to realize that they're perhaps one of the most potent attack vectors in our lives. There are people out there with the power to turn something that makes our lives easier into something that can make our lives a living hell. With just the small piece of plastic we carry in our pockets, someone can steal from us, blackmail us, and terrorize us. So unless we, as a society, begin to exercise a kind of sharper digital discipline, the things we rely on most remain gateways by which pure torture can be unleashed. Born on January 30th of 1989, Brandon Swanson grew up in the Minnesotan city of Marshall. Graduating high school in 2007, Brandon went on to study wind turbines at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College campus in a town called Canby. And by all accounts, Brandon was a dedicated student who enjoyed the idea of contributing to a brighter, greener future. May 13th of 2008 saw the end of the academic year, and to celebrate the cessation of studies, Brandon and his friends attended 2 separate parties held in the college's student accommodation. Friends of his later said that Brandon had consumed alcohol at both parties, but since he knew he had to drive home later that night, he stuck to just 1 or 2 and refrained from getting drunk. At around 1 a.m. on the morning of May 14th, Brandon departed Canby in his Chevrolet Lumina and began the 30-mile drive back to Marshall. It should have been a relatively simple southeasterly drive, but at around 1:45 a.m. that morning, Brandon called his parents on his cell phone to tell them that he'd driven his car into a ditch, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't seem to remove it. He assured them that he was uninjured, but asked them to drive out to his location so they could give him a ride home. It's possible that Brandon neglected to contact emergency services because he feared he'd fail a breathalyzer test, even though it's entirely possible that he was under the legal limit. Besides, he was alone in the dark, shaken up by his near-death experience and pining for the protection of his parents. Moments after the phone call was made, Annette and Brian Swanson climbed into their pickup truck, then drove along Highway 68 in the direction of Canby. Brandon didn't know exactly where he was, so his parents kept him on the phone and told him to signal passing cars with a flashlight so they'd be able to identify his position. Yet after driving for around a half an hour, Annette and Brian had failed to spot any sort of flashing lights from the roadside. Brian Swanson then asked his son if he could see any of the lights from any towns around him, with Brandon replying that he could. Brian suddenly realized that it was very possible that the lights were coming from the small town of Lind, which is roughly 7 miles southwest of Brandon's hometown of Marshall. In order to better coordinate their search efforts, Brandon and his parents agreed to meet up in the parking lot of a bar that they knew of in Lind, and both began heading in that direction while staying on the phone with one another. However, just after 2:30 a.m., exactly 47 minutes into the phone call, Brandon's parents heard something on the other end of the line that made their blood run cold. Their son suddenly cursed loud, as if taken by surprise by something, then remained silent for the remainder of the call. His parents called his name into their phone over and over again, but failed to get a response from him. Brian Swanson then ended the call before attempting to call his son back, but Brandon failed to answer. His parents then continued calling his cell phone over and over again, and when Brandon neglected to pick up a single call, it became increasingly obvious that something horrible was happening. At around 6:30 a.m., Brian and Annette Swanson contacted the Lynn Police Department to report their son missing, but to their horror, the cops didn't take their concerns very seriously at all. They were told that it was hardly unusual for young men that age to stay out all night after the last day of college classes, with Annette Swanson recalling that one of the officers said, and I quote, "Brandon has a right to be missing." Brian and Annette had to forcefully make the case that Brandon wasn't just out partying, nor had any kind of falling out taken place. It was only once they had explained the dire nature of the situation that the Lynn Police Department took any action. Later that morning, deputies discovered Brandon's abandoned vehicle lying in a ditch just off of gravel road along the Lincoln County line, about a mile north of Highway 68. Given the location of the scene, Lincoln County Sheriff Jack Vazecki found himself drafted into the investigation and was charged with giving a statement to the media regarding the progress of the investigation. Vazecki stated that after examining Brandon's car, there was no obvious signs of foul play, but that it was also clear that whatever happened to him had occurred some distance away. They had attempted to employ some rather traditional trafficking techniques, but due to the surrounding area consisting of mostly grass and gravel, it was almost impossible to determine which direction Brandon had walked. With his cell phone being traced to the nearby Yellow Medicine County, ground search teams focused their efforts around that area, with multiple teams of bloodhounds being assisted by an aerial flyover unit. Later that day, one of the trafficker dog teams picked up a 3-mile scent trail that snaked through some nearby fields in the direction of an abandoned farm, then along the Yellow Medicine River to a point where it appeared to enter the stream. Brian Swanson recalled that Brandon had mentioned hearing running water as he walked, so the authorities began to theorize that he may have fallen into the river and drowned. Boats from the state's Department of Natural Resources were deployed along the river, deputies walked the river's banks, and ATVs were deployed in the surrounding area. After the original search efforts turned up no traces of Brandon, most of the resources were reallocated to different missing persons cases. Many believed that since Brandon hadn't showed up again within 48 hours, there was a good chance that he was dead, but others refused to give in to such a cynical mindset. The Swansons left their porch light on all night every night as a symbol of their hope that Brandon would eventually return, while Sheriff Vazecki continued to walk the 2-mile search area of the Yellow Medicine every day for the next month, after promising the Swanson family that he'd do all he could to bring their boy home alive. By the fall of 2008, Sheriff Vazecki had convinced neighboring sheriff departments to resume the search for Brandon, and with planted fields having been recently harvested, there was no better time to do so. In these searches, cadaver dogs began to pick up the scent of human remains into an area northwest of Porter, one that had not been searched during earlier efforts, and by spring of 2011, more than 122 square miles had been searched. Yet despite such a mammoth attempt to recover a trace of the missing Brandon, not a single usable lead could be recovered. For all intent and purposes, it was like the young man had simply dropped off the face of the earth. As far as tangible theories to explain his whereabouts are concerned, there's little evidence to suggest that Brandon drowned that night. Brandon was merely within earshot of the Yellow Medicine River and was nowhere near the edge of it. On top of that, when one of the cadaver dogs followed Brandon's scent to the water, it continued up across the other side and along that riverbank to another gravel road which led to the Yellow Medicine County line. Brian Swanson also recalls that any alcohol his son consumed earlier in the evening notwithstanding, he did not seem disoriented or confused during their phone conversations. As for the possibility that Brandon absconded of his own volition, there is little to no evidence to support that. He and his parents had a close, loving relationship, enough so that his first thought was to call them at the first signs of trouble. He had never professed any desire to run away before, and if he had, There would have surely been sightings of him in the surrounding areas during the days that followed. The only theory that cannot be ruled out is that of some kind of foul play, and this is the explanation that Sheriff Vizecki had put the most stock in. To him, the fact that Brandon's final words to his parents consisted of a single, terrified expletive tells him all he needs to know. Someone could have been lurking in the shadows, he once said, and they got him that way. But who exactly is they? Many have suggested that Brandon is the victim of a single or serial murderer, the identity of whom has yet to be established. Highway 68 is frequented by interstate long-haul truckers, and some of the most prolific and uncatchable killers in American criminal history have practiced that exact profession. But if Brandon was set upon by someone who intended to kill him, there's no evidence of any violence being committed in the immediate vicinity of Highway 68. It's very possible that Brandon was abducted, marched off to a different location somewhere in Yellow Medicine County, then killed and disposed of in a manner which left no trace. But what if he wasn't killed, and whoever took him had a fate worse than death in store? What if Brandon is still alive and became a victim of human trafficking that night? What if those final words spoken to his parents were prompted by the sight of someone who wished to keep him a terrified, starving prisoner, one to be abused daily, long after those that loved him believed he'd passed on? Of course, the last point is complete speculation on my part, but with the complete absence of evidence, it's impossible not to touch on every plausible explanation, even if some are increasingly outlandish. It might sound incredibly morbid, but perhaps some cases of human trafficking might be something of a blessing in disguise. It means that there's a slim possibility that Brandon and his parents will be united someday, if by some miracle he manages to escape. The alternative is almost too horrible to contemplate. That one night, a promising young man made a single foolish mistake after a night of celebration, and while on the phone with his concerned but loving parents, while they were trying to get their only son to safety, his life was violently snatched away. In the year 2008, life began to take a turn for the better for 49-year-old Salt Lake City native Charles Peck. Following a messy divorce back in his home state of Utah, he had met a girl named Andrea from California, and she had recently asked him to move in with her so they could begin planning their dream wedding. However, this wedding would never go ahead, as Charles would tragically become caught up in one of the most horrifying disasters in U.S. history, one which would spark off one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of our age. On September 12th of 2008, Charles was on his way to Los Angeles for a job interview. He had worked as a customer service agent for Delta Airlines at Salt Lake City International Airport for 19 years, and he knew finding a job in LA was a crucial part of his romance-fueled relocation. Charles had gotten engaged to his fiancée, Andrea Katz, just over 7 months earlier, and the painful process of his Utah divorce had left him pining for a change of scenery. So, once they learned of a customer service vacancy at Van Nuys Airport, the couple felt like fate had sprinkled a little bit of good fortune onto their plans. After flying over to LA from Salt Lake City, Charles bought an LA Metrolink ticket to its final stop at Moore Park. There were almost 250 people on that Friday evening train, and it was due to arrive at its final destination at 4:45 p.m., where Andrea planned to pick Charles up. Engineer Robert Sanchez was at the helm, and he had guided the train from Union Station during the second half of the split shift. However, as the locomotive passed through the Chatsworth part of the city, Robert made a single fatal mistake. He had ran a red light. Accident investigators would later confirm that Robert had been texting a friend at the time, and it was this that had caused him to miss the stop signal and failed to give right-of-way to where the double track merged into one line. As a result of his negligence, the Metro collided with a freight train traveling in the opposite direction at a combined speed of 83 miles per hour, and the results were nothing short of catastrophic. Upon learning of the collision, emergency vehicles rushed to the scene of the accident, before dozens of first responders worked frantically to free those who'd become trapped inside the mangled carriages. LA firefighters later described a vision of pure hell, with mangled and maimed bodies, screaming survivors, and almost half a mile of torn and twisted metal lying under the blistering SoCal sun. One firefighter described how he'd witnessed a priest, who just so happened to be a surviving passenger, giving the last rites to some of the dead and dying. Andrea Katz, Charles' fiancée, was understandably terrified when she got word of the crash while en route to Moore Park Station. Yet upon checking her cell phone, she discovered she had a number of missed calls from his cell phone, which obviously gave her a great deal of faith that he had survived the crash. When Charles wouldn't answer her return calls, she tried not to worry too much, as there was a good chance that he was caught up in the whirlwind of chaos while following any major disaster. Instead, she contacted some of his immediate family members, who began making their way to Chatsworth in an effort to track him down. In the hours that followed the Metrolink crash, around 35 calls were made from Charles's cell phone to his friends and relatives. Those that answered heard only static rather than his voice, but all assumed that he was either trapped in the wreckage, too injured to talk, or that his cell phone had somehow been damaged in the collision. Confident in her assumption that he was still alive, Andrea recalled yelling support and encouragement to Charles through the din of white noise, assuring him that rescue was on the way and that everything would be fine. Efforts to free those trapped in the wreckage carried on throughout the night, with the rescue workers using the signal from Charles's phone to try to locate him. Calls from his cell phone would continue until 3 a.m. on the morning after the crash, with each one brightening the hopes of those who believed that he was still alive. Then, an hour after the calls stopped, the rescue team finally found Charles. But contrary to the hopes of those who cared for him, he had not survived the crash. But not only that, his remains were in such a state that medics determined that he had died on impact. He was one of at least 25 people to be killed that day, in what remains one of the worst commuter train accidents in U.S. history. Yet if that was the case, how could he have been making phone calls to his loved ones for the past 11 hours? Many have suggested the impossible, that Charles's spirit was somehow using his phone's frequency to contact those close to him for one final goodbye. Scores of web pages detail people's accounts of calls, voicemails, and emails that have been received from the recently deceased, and even seasoned horror author Dean Koontz had claimed that his dead mother once made contact with him to warn him about a dangerous situation. Yet despite them being improbable, there are certain unifying factors among such calls. They usually occur a short time after the person's death, typically reach people to whom the deceased was close in life, and are often either distorted by static or sound as if though the caller is very far away. In an interview with CNN, fringeology author Steve Volk called these instances crisis apparitions and suggested that such phenomenon occur when a very strong bond exists between two people, one that cannot be extinguished by the death of an individual. This might be a compelling argument, but I think we can agree it's not a particularly scientific one, and in the interest of veracity, we're forced to consider more tangible explanations. Numerous more believable suggestions have been put forward which attempt to explain the many calls Charles' phone made following his grim demise. Shockingly, some have argued that the calls may have been the work of heartless trolls, who sought to spread anguish and chaos in the aftermath of the catastrophe. Yet even the most cursory analysis shows that this is highly unlikely, as only a select group of people knew he was traveling that day, and would have taken an extremely powerful piece of hardware to scan the exact site of the disaster for phones to hack. Another more feasible theory is that of a device malfunction, yet a fault with the handset wouldn't explain why the calls only seemed to extend to Charles's loved ones and not his wider contacts. It was as if someone had hand-selected only those closest to him, as if it really was Charles himself that was controlling the phone beyond the grave. Despite the many attempts to categorically explain what happened with Charles's phone that day, no one has ever been able to do so, and a huge contributing factor is that his cell phone was never actually recovered from the Metro's wreckage. Perhaps the whole thing is just a frighteningly unfortunate failure of technology, nothing but a tragic coincidence. But just maybe, Charles really did somehow cross the barrier between our world and the next, as a way of saying a heartbreaking, final farewell. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Best Fiends a shout out for sponsoring this episode. And you know, when you finish binging the latest riveting podcast on your list, there's always one lingering question staring at you in the face, right? Now what? Sure, you could surf the net and deep dive down the Wikipedia wormhole or something, researching everything related to the show, but when your brain or your browser tabs are full to the brim like mine are, it might be time to take a break from it all and change the pace up a bit. And this is when I like to kick back and clear a few levels on Best Fiends. Recently, I've actually really enjoyed some of the levels and the puzzles, especially some of the boss levels. And I've actually played it a few times between recording sessions too, when I need to rest my voice and take a quick break, which has been a really nice way to play. And I think that's what I love about Best Fiends 2 the most. It's a fantastic boredom quencher, but also it's great for casual gameplay in moments of downtime throughout the day. I also love that more levels, events, challenges are always being added, so the game really never runs out of things to do. The game is free to download and has literally millions of 5-star reviews on the Apple Store and Google Play, which really doesn't surprise me too, because it's just a great little game that always leaves me with that just one more level feeling. So, download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. So I've held on to this story for like the last 6 years because, well, I know it sounds crazy and I've just got told not to talk about it, so I just haven't. But now I want to share it with you guys to get it off my chest. So I went camping maybe 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite that we picked was beautiful too. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot that we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall too. We were in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nobody around us. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back, and we had some dinner. It was all just very normal. That is, until we woke up the next day. Now, I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler in stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him, and we woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept really well that night, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. But when we got out of the tent, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit that we'd made was ruined, the cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All of the doors of the car were open, including the trunk. And we just sort of stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now too. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about these woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised though that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but when I did, they weren't there. Actually, I found them later on the ground, right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and we just left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up, though, when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said that he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it too, but I just can't do it. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. I'm just not sure what it was. So for context, I was raised in a firmly Christian home. My mother and father are deliverance ministers, which is the Christian equivalent of like an exorcist. They would basically take time out of their schedule to help people who called with spiritual issues and, on occasion, cast out demons if the case was really bad. Because of where we lived too, there was quite a few people who had a screw or two loose, mostly because of drugs and gangs and stuff. Often the worst cases of demonic possession would get like 4 hours of chatting, anointing, praying, and casting out demons. Surprisingly too, almost everyone who came in for help got better and sometimes would even become good family friends. Amazingly though, many people who would have been deemed catatonic or schizophrenic would also make a full recovery and live stable lives. I know this is going to sound a bit weird too, but I'm a bit of a skeptic of this. A firm believer in Christ and the demonic, but this is some of my spooky childhood experiences that have stood out to me that I wanted to share with you guys. Like I said, I am a bit of a skeptic still, but anyway, this is what happened. So my childhood home, especially my room, was not a fun place to be after dark. It was a very odd room. Later in life too, I learned why it was actually designed the way it was. The house was actually meant to be built in the opposite direction, and my bedroom was a mistake in the house's design. This led the room to feel just really weird. For instance, the vent system extruded from the ceiling, and a section of the wall in the corner which protruded out with seemingly no reason just stood there. But the weirdest part for me was the sketchy built-in dollhouse. It was a closet that fit under the vent system, and because the way the room was designed, there was no light in the dollhouse walk-in closet. And two experiences in particular in that room have always stayed with me. Both of them scared me really badly as a kid, and I gave the reoccurring experiences, there were more than just these two, nicknames as I got older and moved out of the house. But the first one, I titled Mr. Blanket. So my first paranormal experience has to do with my blanket forts. The nickname Blanket Fort comes from the apparition's appearance. It was always covered under thick cloth blankets. Mr. Blanket would often appear late into the night, somewhere around 11 or 12 p.m. after I'd gone to sleep. And my worst encounter with Mr. Blanket, though, happened during the winter. Everything on the second story was always really cold, and we would often use lots of blankets up there. As a child, seeing all the blankets and the pillows lying about gave me a brilliant idea to build blanket forts in my room. My sister and I would play inside the forts, and we had lots of good memories in there. But on this particular night, we had a pillow fight and left the blankets and pillows strewn all over the floor of my room. I woke up to the sound of something rustling in my room. I looked out across my dimly lit room, and that was when I saw it. The figure stood about 3.5 feet tall and was covered entirely by a blanket. It stood at the corner of my room, and at first I honestly thought that I was dreaming and closed my eyes again. A few seconds later I opened them, and the figure had now moved closer to my bed. It was standing in the middle of my room, and in a panic I sort of got up from my bed and ran to turn the light on. The room was flooded with light, and I turned back, and the figure that I saw was now gone. With only a blanket left on the floor where it stood, I sort of looked around, but there was nothing to find. I went to my parents, who were sleeping in the downstairs bedroom, and I asked if I could sleep with them that night, and told them about what I'd saw. They told me that it was just a dream and I should go back upstairs and get back to bed. Turning the light off and going back to bed was honestly one of the hardest things to do as a kid. I remember thinking that it was waiting for me to sleep, as that's when it would come out. When I finally was ready to sleep too, I decided to open my eyes one last time before passing out. And this is the moment that's always stuck with me. When I opened my eyes, it was only an arm length away from my bed, just standing there, still, like perfectly still, almost as if it was watching me. At that moment, I felt like death was at my bedside, and I felt like if I moved in the wrong way, I would instantly be dragged away by whatever the heck this thing was. It was close enough, too, that I would have been able to reach out and touch its head if I wanted to. My plan from that point, too, was to grab it before it did the same to me. I sheepishly raised my hand toward the figure. It stood as still as a statue before I quickly grabbed the blanket and flung it up onto the bed to reveal nothing. There was nothing under the blanket. No furniture, no sibling trying to prank me, absolutely nothing. After that point, Mr. Blanket, whoever he was, seemed to leave me alone. He did show up once or twice after that, but he never did get as close as he did that cold winter night. Personally, though, compared to the rest of my experiences, Mr. Blanket was definitely one of the worst. The second one, though, is called the Slammer, and to me, Slammer was the scariest one, mostly because it wasn't limited to the night like the other ones. In fact, you could actively watch as in clear daylight as it did its thing. If a door was left open or unlocked, he would mess with them during any time of the day. It got so bad that the doors to the upstairs bedrooms were actually removed at one point. Our parents thought that I and my sister would slam the doors just for fun or out of spite, but we both knew that the doors would fly open or slam shut by themselves. I remember the last night Slammer messed with those doors too. It was when my parents both came home late and I was left alone at home. I was playing with my toys, only to have my closet, which was closed and locked, that's how bad it got eventually, fly open, and I was confused, watched as it closed, leaving a hole in the drywall where the handle was. And to say that I was on edge would be an understatement. But then, the real spooky stuff happened. All three of the upstairs doors opened and then slammed closed all at once. And right at that moment, my 10-year-old self decided that it was high time to do some demon hunting, and I prayed for protection over every room and kept reading of verses from the Bible until my parents got back. And at first, they were really ticked off. They had actually just reinstalled the doors and even added locks for this exact reason, but after I told them what happened and showed them the proof, a kid my age can't slam a door so hard that it breaks a drywall like that. They anointed all of the doors and casted the demonic spirits out of the house. What sticks with me is that after that night, I never had another demonic issue in my room ever again. I eventually moved too, and all of the paranormal stuff went away. My parents also stopped having deliverance sessions in our house after that point too, which I don't know if it's all related, but it could be, I suppose. Like I said at the start, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to a lot of this stuff, but I've definitely experienced enough to know that all of this, it's definitely real.
So I'm a light sleeper, and the softest noises will have me up and awake. My girlfriend, experiencing her second nightmare of the night, was softly moaning, so I turned over in my bed to gently wake her up. But that's when I noticed her standing by the window that is set up near her side of the bed, facing a mirror that is on the adjacent wall. I couldn't make out any particular features besides her very distinguishable messy bun that she had worn to bed, as it was pretty dark in my room, and there was not a lot of light shining through the closed blinds of the window. But I realized that something was still very off, as I would have definitely noticed if she would have gotten out of bed. I stared at what I thought to be my girlfriend, and it didn't move or make any sounds, but I could still hear the sounds of my girlfriend having a nightmare and suddenly realized that she was actually right next to me, laying in the bed. At that very terrifying realization, I said, "What the hell?" and quickly reached to turn my lamp on. But as soon as the light came on, the figure just vanished. So I turned my focus to my girlfriend, who was just waking up from her nightmare, calming her down and explaining what I had just saw. And now we're awake, just searching the internet and trying to think of a rational explanation besides sleep paralysis, because I was definitely awake at the time that I spotted the figure. My girlfriend is joking that we need a blessing of the house because, yes, it's haunted. We've both experienced strange things happening since I moved into this house last year, but it was built in 2006, so it's not that old. Also, a few months ago, she, despite being a very rational individual, also heard male voices laughing, whispering, and thumping sounds coming outside of my kitchen window when I was away on a business trip, and almost called the cops that day, despite me having a state-of-the-art security system and there being no sign of anyone being in the house with her besides my dog, who was asleep at her feet. I've also experienced finding doors open in my home that I know for an absolute fact that I had shut before. My house just doesn't feel organized unless all the doors are shut, so this was pretty unsettling to me. My fire alarm went off as well, one beep, despite there being no fire and having new batteries. I don't know. Do you guys have any ideas about what might be going on? We're both minor believers of the paranormal, but want to find a rational explanation as to what these experiences were, and especially curious as to what the figure by my window could have been. Does this mean that I have two girlfriends now? I'm actually going to a church tomorrow too, and I'm going to ask a priest if they can bless my house. I hung a cross next to my window too, where I saw it standing, but thinking more and more about everything, my dog was actually whining most of that night. My girlfriend's puppy is still in training, so we have her puppy in a crate, and my dog was sleeping in the hallway. Oh, and on our drive home from dinner, I remember that I had two other experiences like this when I was a little kid. A brief overview, but I woke up in the middle of the night and got out of bed to use the bathroom. I stopped in my doorway and looked to my left, and my sister was in her doorway, and my dad came sprinting around the corner. I got pushed back into my room by this thing, and I saw it run downstairs. A few months after that, I was visiting family in Ohio, and we went for a walk. I was just kind of straggling behind, and I looked over my shoulder, and on the top of the hill I saw the same thing. It had the silhouette of a human, but there was just absolutely no color to it, like it was completely solid black. And last night was the first time that I've seen this thing since I was a kid.
My entire surroundings were pitch black, with my headlights being the only source of light. I had to do something, so I tried calling my boyfriend first, but the signal kept getting dropped. I got out of my car and headed toward the deer. Whilst I was making my way over, the crickets around me slowly went silent. Soon the only sound I could hear was my car engine. So I took hold of the deer's legs and I started to drag it out of the way, into the shrubbery on the side. I wiped my hands clean on my shirt and looked up at my car. Sure enough, there it was, right next to my open car door. It was 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, standing on 2 feet. Its pupils were a kind of yellowish orange, and one of its hands was clenching my car door. It was looking right into my soul, panting and frowning like it was full of rage at me.